There are few who agree on the actual origins of war. Some see it as a necessary evil, paving the way for social change. Others see it as simply an extension of political discussion. And even Plato had his say, believing war to be the result of human desire. No one can deny the fact that our history books are littered with the wars waged throughout the ages, as this curiously human form of struggle has existed since man first walked the earth, spanning from the battles of the ancients to the conflicts of the present day. Even so, despite the concept of war being a familiar phenomenon to many by the beginning of the 20th century, nobody was prepared for the utter devastation caused by two of the most terrible conflicts the world had ever seen. Fed by the furnaces of the Industrial Revolution, the advances in military technology now meant that war had taken on a new form, with submarines, deadly mines, aeroplanes, and ultimately, at the end of the Second World War, the most terrible weapon of them all, the atom bomb, causing death and destruction on a never-before-seen scale. Between 1914 and 1918, the First World War brought about the loss of over 40 million lives, civilian and military. Yet only 2 decades later, the world would watch in horror as once more the storm clouds of war again began to gather, emerging unrepentant from the rubble and chaos left in the wake of the First World War. The Second World War was fought between 1939 and 45, and even now, many years later, the question of how this can have happened after what had been dubbed the war to end all wars is still being asked. The nations of Great Britain and the Commonwealth, France and later the United States of America among others, would unite to form the Grand Alliance, more commonly known as the Allies, and they fought to protect democracy and freedom against the threat of Nazi-led Germany, Imperial Japan, and Mussolini's fascist Italy. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, agreed a non-aggression pact with the Nazis right at the outset of the war. But when Hitler reneged on this at a later date, the Russians too joined the Allied cause. The struggle between these many and varied nations would launch the world into a 6-year conflict, incurring the staggering loss of 50 million lives, 2/3 of whom were civilians. Using stunning archive footage, this programme will explore the events that led to the declaration of the Second World War on the 3rd of September 1939, and perhaps more specifically, study how the personalities of two men, Winston Churchill and Adolf Hitler, began to shape the contours of this long and devastating conflict. Looking back with all the benefit of hindsight, it's clear that swifter action and better preparation might have averted a war that still casts its shadows over the memories of people across the globe. But to understand the climate in which the first battle cries rang out, we'll need to step back to the early 20th century and explore history a little more thoroughly. The First World War had left Europe in turmoil, virtually bankrupt, and with many of the political and social institutions that had lain at the very heart of each nation badly shaken. Monarchies were overthrown, Tsars assassinated, and Kaisers fled to be replaced by new and often unstable governments. Mussolini established his fascist state in Italy. The Russian Revolution of 1917 had created the first communist nation, and in Germany, a weak republican government was left to cope with an increasingly unstable society as the humiliation of defeat in the First World War forced Kaiser Wilhelm to abdicate. Many problems in Germany had arisen from the Treaty of Versailles, which had marked the official end of the First World War in 1919. Although the fighting had actually ended on November the 11th, 1918, it took 6 months to finally negotiate a peace treaty. And in the Grand Palace of Versailles outside Paris, in the Hall of Mirrors, the President of America, Woodrow Wilson, British Prime Minister Lloyd George, and the French Premier Georges Clemenceau met to discuss the future of the countries involved in the war, including the vanquished Germans. Before the war, Germany had been the second biggest industrial power in the world after the USA. But the Versailles Treaty set out penalties and limitations that it was hoped would prevent the Germans as a nation ever being able to start a war again. This involved taking away valuable industrial land, its military power, and inflicting a huge war debt on the country. But it simply plunged Germany into an economic crisis. The greatest humiliation of all was the clause that insisted Germany accept full responsibility for the war. And when the German politicians signed the treaty, outraged nationalists, including one young soldier who'd fought in the trenches by the name of Adolf Hitler, denounced them as the November criminals. As the century progressed, the 1920s saw a once proud nation struck by poverty, unemployment, and terrible hardship. And when Adolf Hitler emerged, promising to restore Germany to her former glory, everyone listened. Although Adolf Hitler was born and raised in Austria, he'd adopted Germany as his homeland and had served in the trenches of the First World War for his adopted country, and was even decorated with the Iron Cross for his bravery. After the war, his role changed, and the army, fearing communist uprisings, sent him to spy on the German Workers' Party, and it was here that Hitler discovered politics. Infuriated by a comment one of the guests had made about separating Bavaria from Germany, the fiercely patriotic Adolf made a furious 15-minute speech, and the astonished party members realized that they had found a valuable weapon. Living in poverty in Vienna before the war had already taught Hitler to look for someone to blame for the problems facing a nation, and he was heartened to find the anti-Semitic views he'd once shared with fellow Austrians amongst the ideals of the German Workers' Party, and within days had joined their committee. Impressed by Hitler's captivating speeches, party members grew from tens to hundreds and then thousands. He railed against the Treaty of Versailles, blamed Jews for Germany's problems, and reviled Marxism and communism. Before long, the party had been renamed the National Socialist Workers' Party, or Nazi Party, and Hitler was established as its Führer, soon to introduce the swastika as the party's symbol. But as Hitler's speeches grew even more hysterical, the situation in Germany grew even more dire, and with the Allies demanding a payment for war damages, many became poverty-stricken, leading to hunger riots and chaos. The Nazi Party attempted to seize power as early as 1923 in Munich. However, when the coup failed, Hitler was imprisoned for treason. And although this appeared to be the end of Hitler's political career, it in fact proved to be only the beginning. The passionate speeches he made during his trial were published in newspapers throughout Germany, and suddenly the Nazi Party's ideas began to become a part of public consciousness. Hitler wasted no time in prison, committing his ideas to paper in his book Mein Kampf, and the truly appalling principles that within a decade would shape the future of Germany began to emerge. He blamed the Jews for many of the nation's woes and accused them of conspiracies to control world finances and the press. He hailed the Aryans as the supreme race above the Jews, Czechs, Poles and Russians, believing therefore that he was entitled to acquire more land for Germany. This Lebensraum, or living space as he called it, would be acquired by force, and Hitler spoke of enslaving or eliminating entire races, not to mention the importance of his ambition to first attack France in order to avenge Germany's defeat in World War I. When Mein Kampf was released in 1925, it wasn't hugely popular, but nonetheless served as a warning to the world, despite being a warning that was in effect virtually ignored. But Hitler would have to be patient. Germany's economy stabilised a little, and there was a sense of relief amongst the population, far more interested in enjoying life than listening to talk of war and revenge. Hitler watched and waited, and then the Wall Street crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed it provided him with the window of opportunity he'd been looking for. The effects on Germany were devastating. Banks failed, people's life savings were wiped out in a moment, inflation exploded, and the German economy ground to a halt. Suddenly, poverty and starvation loomed large, and the political centre of the nation, the Reichstag, was in turmoil, at which point Hitler and his Nazis seized the moment, infiltrating the government, rallying more and more support. On January the 30th, 1933, Hitler was made Chancellor of Germany, and as the Nazi brown shirts and the SS marched victoriously beneath the giant columns of Berlin's Brandenburg Gate, thousands cheered them on. Joseph Goebbels, the mastermind behind much of Hitler's propaganda, was overjoyed, writing, "It is almost like a dream, a fairy tale. The new Reich has begun." 1933 saw the end of democracy in Germany. There were restrictions on personal liberty and the freedom of the press. Hitler's henchmen rounded up communists, social democrats and liberals, as thousands were tortured and 51 people were murdered. Hitler's regime of terror had started in earnest. Thousands of the country's finest minds fled from Hitler's new Germany, including the actress Marlene Dietrich, the director Fritz Lang, Sigmund Freud, and even the brilliant scientist Albert Einstein, along with many others. Within days of Hitler's coming to power, Germany began a rapid evolution into a police state where individual freedoms were permanently lost for everyone. Jewish shops were boycotted, and Goebbels ordered books to be burnt that expressed non-German ideas. Support for Hitler continued to grow at an alarming rate, and rallies increased to greater sizes than ever. When the 87-year-old President Hindenburg died on August the 22nd, 1934, Hitler snatched presidential power too, and Germany had a Führer that nobody could either question or challenge. Matters worsened further in 1935, when in direct violation of the Treaty of Versailles, Hitler strengthened the German army. As Hitler methodically built his military machine, thousands of miles away, another dictator had similar plans to gain more land for his country. In October 1935, the Italian leader Mussolini invaded Abyssinia in North Africa, hoping to boost his political prestige and find land to colonise. There was a public outcry in Britain, but despite fierce criticism, Stanley Baldwin's government did nothing to stop the Italian leader. This might well have encouraged Hitler, and when he marched his army into the industrially rich Rhineland, which had been taken from Germany after the First World War, yet again there were no repercussions. On the 7th of March 1936, the world watched and waited for Britain and France to react, but they did nothing, little knowing that if they had, World War II might never even have started. Hitler stated that if the French had marched into the Rhineland, we would have had to withdraw with our tail between our legs, for our military resources were wholly inadequate for even a moderate resistance. And he also threatened to kill himself if Britain and France had acted against him. But with the moment past, in 1936, the world poured into Berlin for the Olympic Games, and as medals were won and the crowds cheered, Hitler continued to plot and scheme. With the outbreak of civil war in Spain, Mussolini and Hitler acted together, offering support to General Franco and his fascist regime. Then in November, Hitler signed a pact with Japan as a very dangerous alliance began to take shape. The Great Depression had also hit the Japanese very hard, not least because Japan relied so heavily on imported material to feed its economy, and from 1931 onwards, conflict with China escalated. In 1937, the battle at Marco Polo Bridge between the Japanese Imperial Army and the Republic of China's National Revolutionary Army marked the beginning of a full-blown war waged between these two giant powers. However, despite its huge population, China had little military strength, and the Japanese had the upper hand, and as they battled it out, Hitler carefully planned his next move. In a secret conference, the Führer met his army and navy commanders, along with Hermann Göring, head of the new Air Force, to put forward his latest European plans. Announcing his objectives for seizing Austria and Czechoslovakia to protect Germany's eastern and southern borders, he stressed the importance of capitalizing on the military and political weakness of France and Britain, describing the countries as two hate-inspired antagonists who must be overcome. Blomberg and Fritsch, his army commanders, were shocked at their leader's willingness to incite war with France and Britain. But Hitler was now so powerful, it was dangerous to even question his actions, and he evidently took a dim view of their lack of support, because shortly afterwards, humiliated by sex scandals, they were removed from their posts. By 1938, unhindered by any opposition, Hitler forced neighbouring Austria into unification. After bombarding the nation with Nazi propaganda for many months, the troops marched in, and the Austrian Chancellor, after arguing with Adolf Hitler for hours, was beaten into subjugation. The country was annexed to Germany without a single shot being fired. This union now placed neighbouring Czechoslovakia in a very dangerous position, and it didn't take Hitler very long to let the world know that this was where he was heading next. 20,000 Nazis cheered, and the world looked on in horror as Hitler threatened war with Czechoslovakia at a Nazi Congress in Berlin. Those who'd built the foundations for the Treaty of Versailles were now in no doubt that action was absolutely necessary. When Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin had retired, Neville Chamberlain had stepped into the breach, taking a strong anti-war stance. And as the gas masks were distributed and sandbags filled, he flew to Germany to attempt to negotiate a peaceful settlement to the growing crises with Hitler. On September the 28th, 1938, 4 world leaders, the French Premier Edouard Daladier, Mussolini, Hitler and Neville Chamberlain, met in Munich to resolve the future of Czechoslovakia. Many of the men in the British cabinet had fought in the First World War, and after experiencing its horrors, felt compelled to prevent a second. So, Chamberlain and Daladier, faced with the threat of another global conflict, agreed to grant Hitler a part of Czechoslovakia, taking the Führer's words that this would be his last territorial claim in Europe. Although the crowds and politicians cheered as Chamberlain returned to Britain, waving Hitler's signed promise of peace, there was one politician who voiced grave concerns. He was none other than Winston Churchill, and he'd been warning about the danger Hitler was posing the free world since his rise to power in the early 1930s. Churchill's comments about the Munich Treaty left no doubt as to his views about Prime Minister Chamberlain's actions, and when he said, "Britain and France had to choose between war and dishonour, they chose dishonour, they will have war," he proved himself to be one of the few people reading the situation correctly. Then, to Neville Chamberlain's disbelief and total horror, on the 15th of March, with no word of warning, Hitler marched into the now vulnerable Czechoslovakia and claimed it as his own, adding their military and industrial strength to that of Germany. The Allies had lost the perfect opportunity to make a stand against the Nazi regime at Munich, and after practically giving Hitler Czechoslovakia on a plate, they were now at an even greater military disadvantage. However, this was only the beginning of Hitler's quest for domination in Europe, and on the eve of a war that would send tremors throughout the world, he now turned his avaricious gaze to the east and to Poland. In the summer of 1939, Germany began a violent campaign against Poland for the return of the land of Danzig and the Polish Corridor, territory that Germany had lost after the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler was careful to ensure he had the support of the Soviet Union before edging east. Despite his hatred of communists, he sent his foreign minister Ribbentrop to secure an alliance and non-aggression pact with the Russian leader Joseph Stalin. For the rest of the world, the writing was on the wall. Hitler was ready for his next attack. Having claimed victory in the Rhineland, Austria and Czechoslovakia with barely a breath of resistance from the rest of the world, Hitler gambled once more that France and Britain would fail to act, and on September 1st, 1939, Nazi troops marched eastwards across the Polish border. But this time, Britain and France were duty-bound to come to the aid of Poland, there being an agreement to do so already in place. So, an ultimatum was issued warning Hitler that if he didn't withdraw his troops from Poland with immediate effect, a state of war would be declared. The deadline for withdrawal was 11 a.m. on Sunday, September the 3rd, 1939. And when no word from Germany was forthcoming, just 15 minutes later, Neville Chamberlain announced to the people of Britain that they were now at war with Germany.
I am speaking to you in the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. This morning, the British ambassador in Berlin handed the German government a final note stating that unless we heard from them by 11 o'clock, that they were prepared at once to withdraw their troops from Poland, a state of war would exist between us. I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
The hours that followed that fearful announcement were nothing short of remarkable, as Londoners enjoying their Sunday morning were hurried to shelters as the air raid sirens began to sound all around the capital. To everyone's relief, it was a false alarm. But dread had already taken a hold over the nation, as people remembered all those who'd been lost in the First World War. By the end of September the 3rd, in just a matter of days, with the fear of a Nazi attack on the horizon, 1.5 million evacuees had been sent to the relative safety of the countryside, including children with their teachers, expectant mothers, and women with babies. The evacuation process was managed extremely efficiently. Every child had a label attached to them with their name, address, and school number on it. They all had to carry a gas mask, toothbrush, comb, soap, towel, nightwear, spare underwear, and if they possessed one, an overcoat. The process was nevertheless extremely traumatic, as families said their goodbyes with the children sent to stations, only to be issued with a blank ticket, as it still wasn't known where their destination would be. However, the first casualties of war that day weren't to be in the cities, but actually far out at sea. The SS Athenia was carrying over 1,000 passengers, including women and children, to Canada from Dublin, and just hours after the declaration of war, the ship was attacked by a German U-boat. 112 lives were lost, making any plans Hitler had for negotiating a peaceful settlement at this stage very unlikely indeed. However, this infamous day did provide the people of Britain with one very good piece of news, as Winston Churchill, who had so fiercely opposed the appeasement of Hitler a year earlier, was appointed First Lord of the Admiralty. In fact, the relief, especially for the Royal Navy, was so great that it said the Admiralty went as far as to flash a jubilant message to all its ships, announcing, "Winston is back." For Churchill, who was born at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire, the son of Lord Randolph Churchill and his lady, the American society beauty Jenny Jerome, this wasn't the first time he'd been First Lord of the Admiralty. After a troubled childhood, seeing little of his aristocratic parents and struggling at school, Churchill turned first to the military and then politics to make his way in the world. But Churchill was never a stranger to controversy, switching political parties on more than one occasion, and also being held responsible for the tragedy that was Gallipoli during the First World War, which meant his time at the Admiralty was short-lived. After Gallipoli, he was demoted, and after many years in the political wilderness, it appeared as if his career was over, and all that lay ahead for Winston was retirement. However, All that changed on the 3rd of September 1939. His country was in desperate need of his straight-talking brand of politics. And being the man that he was, Churchill answered the call. After all, he'd been proved correct over Hitler's evil intentions, and in the nation's eyes, he was the right man for the job, first at the Admiralty and then a great deal more besides. As the British settled into a routine of curfews and nightly blackouts, nothing much appeared to be happening. The only casualties seemed to be from road accidents and people taking falls as headlights and street lamps were literally blacked out. A widespread lack of activity even led to confused evacuees being returned home, as war and any immediate danger seemed to be a very distant threat at this stage. Planes were mobilised and sent to fly over Germany, but rather than dropping bombs, showered civilians and military personnel alike with millions of leaflets telling them of the evils of the Nazi regime. It was also thought this might intimidate the Nazis, showing the people of Germany how vulnerable they were to air raids. But many saw this as a useless confetti war, futile against such an utterly ruthless enemy. And in fact, between the outbreak of the conflict and the end of the year, this period has gone down in history as the phony war. To British civilians, war may have seemed a distant threat. But 1,000 miles away in Poland, it was a very different story. The harsh reality was a nation being obliterated by the Nazi forces, and the people in Poland were in desperate need of help from the Western Allies. Hitler's Nazi commanders showed no mercy in their attack on Poland. The once calm fields and forests shuddered and shook as swift columns of tanks and armoured trucks thundered through the landscape, destroying everything in their path. The German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, swooped across the skies above, obliterating buildings and roads, scattering civilians in all directions. This revolutionary tactic was called blitzkrieg by the Germans, or lightning strike, and it meant the Nazis could attack with speed and surprise rather than succumbing to the stalemate of trench warfare that was familiar to so many after World War I. The British and French, who believed the Polish were capable of maintaining their defences for 2 to 3 months before needing additional military support, were sadly mistaken. Huge numbers of civilians were killed as terror bombing swept through Poland, with the Nazis merciless in their attack, ruthlessly murdering many Poles. Operation Tannenberg took 20,000 lives, with shootings at 760 mass execution sites. But these cold-blooded killings were only the beginning of countless atrocities that would be committed during the Second World War. Waiting for help from their Western allies, the Polish militia and civilian volunteers bravely tried to defend their capital, Warsaw. Meanwhile, the British Expeditionary Force had been quickly shipped to France, and 500,000 British and French troops now sat tight on the fortified Maginot Line along the French border with Germany, awaiting the order to attack. But the command never came. The Allied leaders were convinced they were still underprepared for war and hesitated to march their troops across the German border. They hadn't any idea that there wasn't a single tank left along the German defensive line, better known as the Siegfried Line, as the Nazis were more concerned with obliterating Poland. Had the Allies taken action at this stage, the war may well have been cut short. Sadly, the intelligence came too late, and the brave Poles were steadily being crushed. But worse was still to come. On September the 17th, the Soviet Red Army, 800,000 strong, marched into an eastern region of Poland to stake their claim, just as Stalin had agreed with Hitler, carving up the Polish nation between them. Hundreds of miles to the west, the people of Warsaw fought on until disease, starvation, and utter exhaustion forced them to surrender. The beautiful capital of Poland had been literally bombed to the ground, and on the 28th of September, the defeated militia were marched out of the city as the Nazis victoriously marched in. In the aftermath of Poland, as Chamberlain spoke in the Commons, the cabinet found the Prime Minister vague, whereas the strong and concise words of Churchill were really captivating the nation. Even Hitler was now viewing the First Lord of the Admiralty as Britain's rightful leader, particularly after the fall of Poland, when he once again tried to make peace with the Allies, but addressing Churchill and his friends rather than Chamberlain. Although Britain and France had failed to prevent the loss of Poland, they were now at least in no doubt about Hitler's intentions to build his empire, and they started to prepare to defend themselves. Once war had been declared, a National Service Act in Britain meant men between 18 and 40 were liable for call-up to the Army, Navy or Air Force. There were also many who signed up voluntarily throughout 1939. As well as mobilization on European soil, there was also a great deal of movement amongst the Commonwealth countries as Indians, Cypriots, Australians and New Zealanders began training, and Canada offered support with military and financial aid. Soon airmen and soldiers, ships and supplies began flowing into Britain from all over the world to help in the fight against Nazi Germany. Despite the support from the Commonwealth, many European countries preferred to stay neutral at this time, unwilling to risk their fragile economies and reluctant to damage their ties with the German market. The United States was keen to stay out of the war and unwilling to send their citizens into battles being fought on foreign soil. However, President Roosevelt did place US arms at the disposal of the Allies in America's Neutrality Act of 1939. Norway and Denmark also wished to remain neutral, just as they had in the First World War, but events were about to force them into the heart of the battle, because Norway and Denmark were only months away from being drawn into the conflict. While Britain enjoyed relative peace on the mainland, the onslaught at sea was quite a different matter, and many lives were already being lost. A torpedo from a German submarine struck the HM aircraft carrier Courageous and took with it 515 men and the gallant captain, who remained on the bridge until the end.
Erste Welle fertig. Feuer! Schon wieder einer.
But the Royal Navy, under Churchill's command, fought back fiercely, and while the phony war continued on the home front, at sea Hitler was left in no doubt that the British Navy was a force to be reckoned with. Nevertheless, it wasn't only Hitler pushing to expand his territory, because just 2 months after securing land in Poland, the Soviet Union struck again, drawing Finland into the conflict. Despite the non-aggression pact with Hitler, Stalin felt vulnerable in Europe and feared Germany, France or even Britain might use Finland as a bridgehead for an attack on Leningrad. It had been agreed as part of the deal that Finland would be consigned to the Soviet sphere of influence, and the Russians were keen to take what they viewed as rightfully theirs. In the autumn of 1939, the Soviet Union demanded that Finland move their border 25 kilometers back from Leningrad. But when this didn't happen, Stalin ordered the invasion of Finland on the 30th of November 1939. Defeating the Finns appeared a relatively easy task, as the Soviets outnumbered them by 4-1, their tanks by 200-1, and their aircraft by 30-1. But Stalin's army would have a longer and tougher fight on their hands than they'd ever imagined. The winter of '39 was to be one of the harshest in the country's history, with temperatures at times dropping to 20 degrees below zero. The Soviets were unprepared, and as Stalin had mobilized troops from the south of Russia, they were unused to such awful weather conditions. Conversely, the Finns were on familiar territory, and fast-moving ski troops dressed in white camouflage suits put up a fierce fight against the invaders. Despite alarming shortages in equipment, weapons and ammunition, the Finns picked off the Russians as they huddled around their campfires and captured their supplies. The Finnish snipers could easily spot the dark uniforms of the Soviets, which made them an easy target against the snow. In fact, one of them, a farmer by occupation, managed to kill 542 Red Army soldiers, making him the deadliest sniper in military history. The world became captivated by the Finnish plight and their ghost-like troops gliding through the dark winter forests, and the fight against the Soviets united a nation which only 20 years earlier had been ripped apart by a bloody civil war. Christmas 1939 brought the Finns together with a sense of national unity as their troops continued to fight a common enemy, while back in Britain, families sat down to enjoy Christmas dinner and open their presents, wondering whether the war would ever reach their shores. As the new year of 1940 dawned, the conflict at sea suddenly began to have a different effect on the nation. As Britain imported huge quantities of food, attacks from German U-boats were making it very difficult for cargo ships to make their deliveries, with bacon, sugar and butter becoming the first of many foods to be rationed. Each family was given a ration book with coupons to make sure that everyone got their fair share, as the British began to feel the first effects of war. A key player in the loss of British merchant ships was the heavily armed German battleship, the Graf Spee, which had managed to sink no less than 9 Allied ships in 1939. 8 groups from the British and French navies were organised to hunt the German raiders down, and the sea chase that followed culminated in a dramatic battle off the coast of Argentina, which would bring exciting news for the British back home. Although the Navy managed to sink the Graf Spee, there was still the issue of 300 British prisoners, captured from the ships the Nazis had sunk and transferred to another German ship, the Altmark, to be addressed. The Admiralty, under the command of Winston Churchill, ordered the destroyer HMS Cossack to rescue the men, and the Altmark was finally tracked down in neutral Norway, hiding in a fiord. The Cossack followed her in, ran alongside, and after a dramatic battle resulting in hand-to-hand combat, the prisoners were finally rescued. When the Cossack came home with the British prisoners, the returning heroes were given a jubilant welcome. In London, Churchill paid tribute to the Navy's victory, making him even more popular with the people of Britain. And as Chamberlain's government continued to disappoint, he became the obvious choice to lead the nation against Adolf Hitler's advances. Amidst all the excitement, the Allies continued to plan their mission to provide aid for Finland. But by the 15th of March, the badly bombed-out Finns could wait no longer and decided to make peace with the Red Army. Just as the Soviets had demanded, the new frontier was put in place, forcing 200,000 Finns to pack up and leave their homes. The failure to help Finland led to great discontent amongst the people of France and Britain, and the Allied leaders were blamed for their lack of action. Only 5 days after the Moscow Peace Treaty was made with Finland, the French Premier was replaced, and the writing was on the wall for Neville Chamberlain, as the number of his critics grew in the House of Commons. The fall of Finland had not only shaken the British and French, but its Scandinavian neighbours were now beginning to doubt whether staying out of the war would be an option. Both the Allies and the Germans were now focusing on Norway, which was geographically important to both sides, as well as being an important outlet for Swedish iron ore, fueling the Nazi military machine. Winston Churchill was keen to put troops into Norway, but Chamberlain and the cabinet refused to listen to his warnings, and yet again the Allies lost an opportunity to be one step ahead of Hitler, who quickly seized the moment. The Nazi attack on Norway and Denmark left no doubt that the Germans' military skill and organisational abilities were devastating. Ironically, the Allies had expected the Germans to proceed by land, rather than risking a confrontation with the superior forces of the British Royal Navy. But this is precisely what the Nazis did. On April the 9th, 1940, the Nazis launched their attack on Denmark and Norway and took everyone by surprise. Denmark surrendered immediately, losing only a few soldiers, but Norway continued to resist for as long as they could. Faced with the extraordinary tactics of the Germans, defending Norway was virtually impossible, and before Britain, France and the Norwegians could gather and organise their forces, the Germans had seized strategic territory along the coast, reaching as far north as the port of Narvik. When news reached London, and Churchill's wise words were again proved correct, at first the cabinet struggled to believe what they were being told. As a result of Chamberlain's indecision, the Allies had lost Norway before they could even begin to think of saving it. The Nazis now had a firm foothold, worryingly close to Britain, and although Hitler's ships were being constantly hit in battle, the Germans resolutely forged ever onwards. For the British public and the nation's politicians, the appalling blunders of Chamberlain's government over Norway caused a furious debate. And in the House of Commons, it was evident that the Prime Minister no longer had the confidence of his people, and honourable to the last, Chamberlain resigned. On May the 10th, 1940, Winston Churchill, despite being 65 years old, became Prime Minister of a coalition government that would last for the duration of the war, and as far as the grateful nation was concerned, Winston was, without doubt, the best man for the job. Finally, Hitler would have to face a worthy adversary in his fight for domination in Europe. And the speech Winston Churchill gave as he became Prime Minister served notice on the Germans that they would no longer be able to take their success for granted. He said, I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears and sweat. You ask, what is our policy? I can say, it is to wage war by sea, land and air with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us. To wage war against a monstrous tyranny, never surpassed in the dark, lamentable catalogue of human crime. That is our policy. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word. It is victory. Victory at all costs. Victory in spite of all terror. Victory, however long and hard the road may be. For without victory, there is no survival. But even as Churchill was on his feet in the House of Commons uttering these now famous words, the very tyranny he spoke of was edging ever closer towards British shores, advancing at tremendous speed through the Netherlands and the Low Countries. The Nazis simultaneously attacked cities in Holland, Luxembourg and Belgium, leaving death and destruction in their wake. And as buildings crumbled and refugees fled, the Germans were swiftly carving a path towards subjugating their oldest enemy, the French. Hitler knew that sooner or later a battle would have to be fought with France, and he also knew his army was much smaller than that of the French. But using speed and his blitzkrieg tactics, he once again succeeded in penetrating defences. But this time, after learning the error of their ways, the Allies didn't hesitate. Immediately mobilised British and French forces began to move forward to make contact with the Belgian army, aiming to create an unbroken line of defence stretching from the English Channel to the borders of Switzerland. Nevertheless, the line didn't hold up against the Germans to the south, and in a matter of days, the entire BEF and half the French army found themselves cut off. By May the 12th, the Germans were already on French soil, and just a day later, a 50-mile gap had grown between the two halves of the French army. The Luftwaffe had inflicted huge losses on the RAF, the French Air Force had been virtually destroyed, and the Germans were only 3 days into the invasion. As 1 million refugees found themselves not knowing where to go, with Holland already lost and Belgium faltering. On the 16th of May, the French Commander-in-Chief, General Maurice Gamelin, confessed to the Anglo-French Council of War in Paris that he had no reserves left. It was a grim day for France, and matters were deteriorating fast. By May the 20th, the Germans had reached the coast, and there was now a line of Nazi soldiers stretching from Germany to the sea, separating the Allied forces. The situation was grave, and the Allies now risked losing the entire British expeditionary force as they were surrounded by the enemy and being pushed further towards the sea. The battle-weary British soldiers were under attack from every angle, and finally fell back towards the northern French town of Dunkirk. Thousands of lives were going to be lost, and Hitler was convinced that victory would be his, leaving France wide open, ready for a Nazi occupation. But Hitler, despite his military success to date, had without doubt underestimated the tenacity of Winston Churchill and the British people, who were about to make history with one of the most extraordinary rescue operations known to man. The phony war was over, and with Europe reeling from Hitler's onslaught, the storm had broken, and the race for Dunkirk was on.